It's time for Market Explainer, your number one business news podcast. Hosted by Danny and the big man. And it starts right now.
So this next story is inflation. It continues to happen. And I've seen some TikToks and some Instagram reels and some other things about the subject that make me go, isn't this what happens when people are stupid? So one of the tweets is from this guy named Dan Price, and Robert Reich or whatever the guy's name is. And they're like, this is not inflation. This is greed on the part of corporations charging more money. And they cite as a source.
That is partially true. Go ahead.
It's not partially true. It's totally incorrect. But they cite as a source. Look at how all these corporations have higher profits. And my thing is, well, listen, when inflation takes place, here's what happens. You have $1. Now $1 buys 80 cents worth of stuff. So in order to buy $1 worth of stuff, you have to buy $1. It costs $1.20. Mm-hmm. It's a basic. I literally saw someone a girl put up a TikTok, and it's surrounding the subject of modern monetary theory, and it simply says we can print money, and the value won't go down if we say it doesn't go down. And here's my thing: value is subjective. Number one, and number two. This isn't like Harry Potter's Wizarding World, okay? This isn't magic, all right? If you have more of a thing, it's just less valuable. It's just the way it goes, okay? Sometimes it can inflate a market in a micro sense. NFTs are that way right now. We feel like they're not going to be worth more. I think we were talking about this in the pre-show, like, Twitter, the first tweet Jack Dorsey ever sent, sold for $2.something million. They put it up for $48 million. Couldn't get over $1,000 in bids. So what I'm relating that to say, like, value is subjective, and you can't just say, like, because when he did it, it was NFT.
Okay, this is one of those. You can normally make the argument that value is subjective. Yes. Not in this. This is not subjective. No, it's not.
Well, I mean, are you saying that
it is subjective on anything from the primary market? Okay? If I buy a gallon of milk for $1 and I want to sell it for $3, that's subjective. But going to the store and buying $1 of gallon of milk like everybody else in the grocery store sells it for $1 is not subjective.
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the dollar's value will go down because there's more of them.
Well, and that's where the good old-fashioned look. Economics boils down to the same thing it always does. One truth of economics. Supply and demand. As supply goes up and demand goes up, the price goes up. Right? Or supply goes down, one goes up, one goes down, right?
Right.
It's the balance of the world. My point is this inflation, which in simplest terms, I know Danny said 20%, 80%, all of these. In simplest terms,
I didn't say 80%. I said 20%.
Well, I'm just saying, if a dollar was 80%, you threw out a lot of numbers. In simplest terms, inflation is if you paid $1 last year for a gallon of milk, and that same gallon of milk this year was $1.10, that's inflation. You're buying the same gallon, it's just 10 cents more expensive, right?
Yeah.
Now, you also combine that with how people are getting paid, how much money people have to buy that. Now, the reality and what's causing this big stir, the inflation is not the only conversation as part of this. Right. It also has to do with people and money and pay rates and all this stuff. Because the fact is what 8.5% inflation means to you, right, as an individual, means that unless you got a 9% raise this year, like, if you're making 9% more in 2022 than you did in 2021, you are actually losing money in comparison to last year.
So I'm going to say some pseudo-political stuff now. We're just all going to have to gird our loins and live with it. I am a huge fan and have been a huge follower of Ron Paul for the longest time. And he's always said, if you have fiat currency where there's nothing that backs it, then the government can just print money willy-nilly, which it did in 2020 and 2021. And the consequence is that the value of your dollar. You can buy less and less with the dollar, and wages will never, ever, ever keep pace with the inflation. So it's simply the case that a company is now paying. And listen, there is something else to factor in here. There's a shortage of goods because of manufacturing slowdowns and shutdowns and shipping shutdowns and slowdowns. So that factors into this a bit. And some economists are saying 8.5%. Other economists that I follow more closely will say if you use certain calculators that were more popular in the 80s, because some of the way they calculate inflation is, well, we're not going to include bread, milk, cheese, gasoline, all of this stuff. Well, we don't include that as inflationary because that's whatever, which is stupid.
Okay, so you have
then it's 8.5%. Yeah,
you have two categories. You have the consumer price index, right? Which includes things like, your household electricity bill,
goods,
your gas bill, whatever, right? And then you have what's called the CPI in line, which eliminates your food and energy, right?
Yeah,
so it's much more simplified, right?
Yeah,
and inflation, when you take out food and energy, is a little less, right? I think it's 7.
Whatever,
I think it was 5.6. I'm sorry. So 5.6 versus 8.5. Right. So you go, okay, what's really driving the bigger portion of it is obviously energy and food, right?
Right.
That when you talk about supply and demand, we sell X numbers of gallons of milk in America every day, right?
Right.
And when you know that supply line has been disrupted by a Panini, by truck drivers, and by a whole bunch of stuff, you mess with the supply, the demand goes up, the price goes up, right?
And this is already, I'm seeing this like I had to go to a couple grocery stores to get everything that I wanted because not everybody had.
And then when you do, you pay more for them. But here's the deal. Here's where Danny and I agree, because look, I'm telling you facts, right? What I've said so far are just facts of 8.5 in the last 12 months.
And I'm
where
just
Danny and
saying
I differ is Danny doesn't think that Danny is a true to life anarcho-capitalist.
Yes.
Even though the anarchy side of Danny's brain doesn't make any sense. But let's just say, from the capitalist standpoint, that Danny believes that if you can make $1.50 off of a gallon of milk when everybody else is charging $1, good for you. You just made 50 cents more. Where I don't believe that it should be necessarily true. What Danny said at the beginning of this story was Congress is getting on to companies about being greedy during a pandemic to get more money. That is reality. There's not you can't even untie that knot that it's not true. Now you can argue whether it's right or wrong, but it's the truth. The fact is they've used the Panini and supply chain issues to keep prices high or make them higher.
Well,
when their cost of the product is not changing.
Well, that's the thing is, do we know that their cost of the product isn't changing? Because what I will tell you is, I know that truck drivers, so many of whom got off the road because the industry had just gotten so overregulated and complicated. A lot of these truck drivers don't even run into California. They had to raise the price for runs into California and New York. Hey, port cities of this country, right? Where California changed its legislation. So it created the dock workers are now making fortunes more than they were making. And so the interesting thing is the group of people who are like workers' rights and people need to make more money and blue collar workers need to make a fortune. Great. The consequence of that is higher priced goods. And
of course,
these characters that are saying, well, you cannot tell me that if you look at a country like Venezuela that print money willy-nilly, right? Whose prices, like what is the value of the Venezuelan bolivar? You have to go to an Instagram account every morning and check what it's going for. So you can know what things cost because that is how rapid the inflation is. Well, that is a lesson in modern monetary theory, which is if we just say they think it's magic, right? They think this isn't a science, it's magic, right? That the value is assigned by the top people. And if we just become the top people and we control everything, And
No.
the reality is, this is a failure of the central banking system. And people like me who are critical of that system say, hey, listen, crypto is imperfect. It's distributed, but it's not, it's imperfect.
It's not going to happen. Stop trying to make it happen.
That's fine.
Crypto
That's
is
fine.
never going to be the universal currency. It's
Sure.
not even going to be the one country that we did a video about.
El
I forget
Salvador.
which country
Yeah.
that made it as a cryptocurrency. The business companies, the business people in that country are literally currently lobbying to try and get it ousted because it's costing them a fortune.
Yeah.
But I digress. The
Yeah,
point
no.
is,
But what I was trying to
Go
say
ahead.
though is like this concept that it lives out there in the ether. These have already been proven to not work, and they're scientifically incorrect, right? This is there is no gravity, the earth is flat. This is flat earth economics, right?
no.
Yes, it is.
To
Modern
your side is
moneta-
flat Earth economics.
No, it's-
Current economics is Danny's point is he's saying that the government put too much money out
Yes.
into America, and
Yeah.
by doing so, that is one of the theories behind inflation. Is when the market is hot, people are spending money because they have quote unquote too much money, right? That is one of the things inflate. Now I'm saying it. What I'm saying though is I don't think that this is caused. That's where we differ. I don't
Okay.
think that this is caused. Maybe a little bit, but again, when you talk about your average American still doesn't have $1,000 in the bank,
Right.
you're not talking about. There's still not. The government didn't give out enough money to
Yes.
make the average American get more
So-
than $1,000 in their bank.
Correct.
So it's not necessarily that.
So,
and you say,
I
how do
know-
we know they're making more money? The companies is because of profits. They're all publicly
Right,
traded.
right.
They're all. If you sold 1,000 gallons of milk last year, and I just keep using that analogy to keep it simple.
Right.
If I sold 1,000 gallons of milk last year and made $1,000, and I sell 1,000 gallons of milk this year and made $3,000, it doesn't matter if my product price went up because I made $3,000.
Well, no. So what I'm saying is and this is part of why this feels like hocus pocus, is because what I'm saying is it took you $1 the value of the dollar went down, so your purchasing power went down with it. And when your purchasing power goes down, the cost of goods, the number goes up, but the value of that thing hasn't really changed. It's just that the number changed and the number's higher. And that is the consequence of printing. Some reports are saying they printed $8 trillion, not just $4.
It doesn't matter how much money they printed.
Yeah.
Again, if
It doesn't matter.
profits didn't outweigh.
Yeah. So we're talking
Again,
in circles
but
at this
anyway.
point, but it's fine.
Right.
But I'm
And
just
then
saying,
how the government combats this, there's only one way for the Fed to combat this, and that's
Interest
to
rates
increase
hikes.
interest rates, right?
Yeah.
Which is a tax on you in a completely different way, right?
Correct.
Your credit card interest rates go up, the price
Yep.
of you buying a home. For example, at one point, at the beginning of this year, January into February, you could get a home loan, 30-year home loan, anywhere between 2.5 to 3.25.
3 points.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so as of a week ago, the interest rates one day last week popped up above 5%.
Yeah.
That's
And-
a 2.5 point swing
Yeah.
in 3 months.
Right. And here's the thing. I always like to point this out. People, when we watched The Dark Knight, the film, the fantastic Christopher Nolan Batman film, no one ever gave credit to the Joker for piling up all that money and burning it. But he was really just anti-inflation, right? He was doing his part to combat inflation.
That's what he was doing. See, I
Yeah.
knew there was a reason. I just
Yes.
didn't know. But
He
look,
said it
if
was
you-
about sending a message, and this is the message. We are against printing money.
If you want to know how bad how bad it can be, inflation can be scary for an economy.
Yeah.
And how bad the Fed will combat it. Go ask your pop, your grandpa, right?
Yeah.
Old pappy, whatever you want. Ask
Right.
him what his first home loan interest rate was.
Right.
Okay? Because this is not the first time in this country we've seen stuff like this.
Right.
We are currently setting records that date back to the late 70s and early 80s, which is
Right.
the last time it happened very well. And people that weren't alive back then don't remember that the Fed was so anxious to get it down that
Yeah.
interest rates to buy a home in the early 80s were between 15 and
20%.
25%.
Right. And so, and listen, this is another criticism that I hear from people, which is like, well, when my parents bought a house, the interest rate was, or they bought a house for $60,000, and now that same house is worth, 350. How am I expected to be able to afford it? I was like, well, your parents made $20,000 collectively, and the interest on their house was 20%.
Yeah.
So, and you're not factoring all that stuff in. So the criticism I'm trying to levy here is that people who say we can just print money and there's no consequences then complain about the consequences, not realizing that we have spent decades printing money with low interest rates and giving that money out, and that has not created the equality in the economy where people own homes and all this other dumb stuff that people think is important. We haven't created that by printing money. Now, and I'm going to say something political here, is I'm not a huge fan of Jimmy Carter, but Carter always is kind of like he's this idiot and he was a terrible president. But a lot of what Carter did actually, which kind of blended into Reagan's era, he appointed this Volcker to the Federal Reserve, and he's the guy who jacked interest rates to the moon. And those extremely high interest rates corrected and made the dollar very strong and created all the prosperity that, people refer to as Reaganomics, but really is like ultimately the downstream what was Bill Clinton's era of government, which was like, so
climbing out of a recession that those interest rates caused. That's what they're trying to avoid this time around. They don't want to spike in Fed rates and stuff like that, because they don't want to send us into what became the mid 80s, which was a recession. Right. So they don't want to send us into a recession, right? They just need everything to level off. They need everything to slow down a little bit.
And so it's I'll use this example. If you've ever seen the movie I can't remember. Pilot. It's the one where the guy's the pilot and he like turns the plane upside down. I can't remember.
Oh, wasn't that based on a real story? It had Denzel Washington, I think.
Yes.
Played the pilot. But I think it was based on a real story.
Okay, well, either way, Denzel Washington has a alcohol problem in the film. His character has an alcohol problem. And the night before his review board, they do all this stuff to get him dried out, and he's cleaned up, he's sober, but he goes into the hotel room that, the door's connected and it's open, and someone has already taken everything out of the bar in his room. He gets into the bar and he's wasted. So they come to get him there. His union rep and attorney or whatever are there, and they go, "What do we do?" He has to testify before the review board, the FAA or whatever the review board, the NTSB, whatever it is. And he goes, "You need to call my coke dealer to level me out." So that's what, because like he's clearly intoxicated, but the coke brings him back. So that's what we're doing right now. We've been on an alcohol fuel binge. We've binged on booze for 2 or 3 years. Our liver's about to give out, and we're like, we got to level this thing out. Get me some coke. So he's just bumping rails with John Goodman in a hotel room.
See, I want to agree with you, because that is one of the ways that inflation happens, and I'm not saying that's not part of a bigger piece of the puzzle. My issue would be, I would become more likely to believe that as a quote-unquote driving force if people had more money in their bank accounts. Well, if your average person came out the other end better. Right,
yeah. So, and here's why I disagree with that. Free economics, people like Peter Schiff and Milton Friedman and stuff will tell you that this kind of activity, the kind of stuff the Fed has done, and this is not that they just came up with this theory 2 years ago. This has been the established way of thinking, that the wages will never keep pace with it, because the inflation goes like this and wages go like this. That's just, and they're scientists talking about a science, and they're telling you how things work. And let me just say this.
You combine that with companies making record profits. Well, companies, if a company, okay, let's just say, for example, in the last year,
so what I'm saying is those record profits are a non-metric. They don't factor into this the way people are saying.
But they have to, because that means to me the company's not carrying their end. And you could make the argument as a company, if you own stock in a company and they're a publicly traded company, that That's their job, is a company's job, is to protect your
Right.
profits, which make your dividends or your stock price rise. I get that, but here's the point. And when you get into people, this is why I get leftist when it comes to people, right? Is when it comes to people and you go, okay, the inflation for the last 12 months is 8.5%. That's just a
Right.
fact. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That means that if you didn't get an 8.5% raise, your money
You're
doesn't go
losing
as
money.
far.
Right.
In a company that instead of giving you a 2% raise when they know
Right.
it was inflation was 8.5%, if they gave you that 9% raise,
Right.
right, which gets you over, which, okay, you didn't grow a lot, but you grew some, right?
Right.
You would still be making record profits. That's
Yeah,
where the working
so-
man comes in and goes, you could share
Right.
with who makes your product, the employee,
Right.
and you could still show record profits,
Right. And so,
but you're
here's-
choosing to show even more record profits and screw
Right.
me, the working
Yeah,
guy.
right. And you know what is interesting is I think, I read this in this, I don't remember where I read it, but it felt like a credible source at the time. Each congressional office, or not congressional office, sorry, each committee, their budget has been bumped by 22% automatic. So that means that the government is recognizing a
Inflation.
they're recognizing inflation, but they're treating it with a different number. So the other problem is, hey, in order to go get a worker now, I'm in a situation where the house I'm living in right now is up for sale, so I'm not cooking as much in there. So I'm going to Chipotle every day because it's organic and whatever, blah blah blah. In the last week, I've gone into Chipotle. They've had no staff. They've closed. Like we're talking 6 p.m. They're closed. They have no supply. I walk in there and they go, "Hey, sorry, we're out of steak, barbacoa, chicken, all of the food, ingredients I usually want in my burrito." And you go, so they
And
they
then
have-
on top of that, if you did find what you want to order, it's more
Yeah.
expensive. That's
Yes.
my point entirely, right?
Right, and
Companies
that's
are
that's
choosing that.
right, and that's the cause of inflation. Inflation says, in order to get a thing that was $10 last year, you need to spend 15 this year. And that's companies. Several of these companies have said, our costs have gone up more than 15%, but we're only charging the consumer 3 or 4 to 5 or 6%.
Yeah, but that's short term. See, that's good old fun fashion company speak. They do it in the housing market, building houses all the time. Oh, last spring, the price of wood has gone up 300%. I'm not charging you 300% for more for that house. But when you average it over the last the last 10 years, they're paying less than, you know what I mean? It's all an average for them, but they use headlines as corporations. And again, good on them. It's just good PR. They use certain headlines to their advantage, right? To make themselves, they're in the muck with you. They're in the victim with you, right? Well, we're all at the behest of the ships sitting at the port in California or what,
And so I'm just saying is, we have to factor that in and go, hey, the ports in California have changed their operating mandates or whatever, and they've said workers have to get paid exorbitant money, or workers they can't work a lot of shifts. Well, you can't unload. The backlog of ships sitting on the port in California, you have to account for that and part of it too is when you hollow out your economy and you don't make anything here and you rely on stuff to get shipped somewhere else, that's a problem, right?
Well, but the argument on the labor side of it, and I'm not a big union guy, but the part of it on the labor side of it is, let's say you're Chipotle, for example, right?
Right.
You go, well, if Chipotle would just continue to increase their wages until they found a staff that was willing to deal with it, right? And then charge if they can't pay a staff to keep staffed, and still make your Chipotle burritos for a price that you're willing to pay, then a lot of people argue then it's not a viable business.
And I'll make the argument that the people who were working there for $16 an hour and go, I don't want to do this anymore, they're not going to Wendy's. Like, where are you going? What are you doing with your life? How do you pay your rent?
They're living with their Gen X and Boomer parents. That's what they're doing.
Right.
So that's the point, right? So that again.
That stops
I'm
being.
I'm not picking on millennials.
Me neither.
Okay, I'm not picking on millennials, but Millennials are acting according to the safety net they have. Okay? You only quit that job making 12 or 13 or $16 an hour doing something you don't want to do if you have someone to fall back on.
And by
Generation
the way,
X, the baby boomers, did not have that option. When you lost a job, your family wasn't going to eat.
Right. And let me just put it this way too. I know kids getting their first job right now at 15 or 16 at McDonald's getting $17 an hour. I've worked corporate jobs for less money with a bachelor's degree. I'm not complaining. I'm saying good for them, but I'm simply saying that I don't know how much. Again, so Big Man and I are saying two different things here. I'm saying that they're not being greedy. It's just that everything is costing them more too. And so
I think it's greedy too.
Okay,
I think it's
greedy
too. I think it's a combination of all of it, and it typically is. There's an algorithm that some bean counter, right?
Right.
There are people, some like Walmart and everybody else, have a whole bunch of bean counters in a room going, hey, if we raise this 2 cents and take this other one minus 1 cent, we're going to get an extra cent on every of this more sold item. And then we can say we didn't raise prices because we offset it over here, right? Like, there's a whole bunch of people figuring out that, and it's probably both of what Danny and I both said. There's probably, there's too much money in this demographics, and it's just going to affect everybody. You know what I mean? And middle class usually gets that algorithm. It's either, if it doesn't affect the middle class, well, it's going to screw over the poor. Well, no, it doesn't affect the middle class, so... You know, so it's an algorithm of a bunch of these different things.
Right. And so, and just in parting, let me just say this much. The poor are the people who need the dollar to hold its value the most. And since the United States got off the gold standard with Nixon, the dollar has lost over 90% of its value. And these are scientific facts that you can look up. I'm just saying. Mathematical, scientific facts that you can just look up, and there's no contradictory explanation. And it's on some level, to the layman, the non-economist, the non-scientist, this feels like hocus pocus magic. And that's why a lot of the dialogue, even from CEOs, even from a former advisor to the president, like Robert, whatever the guy's name is, you hear the dumbest, idiotic things saying that's corporate greed. They're just raising money. Now, if I hear a guy at a bar say that who doesn't know what he's talking about, who packs UPS trucks for a living, whatever. Now, if I hear that from somebody who should know better, idiot. That's all.
It's part of the equation. Anyway, what's our last story? Let's get to our last story there, Danny.
All right. Before we do that, as you always know, our show is brought to you by Big Man Gear. BigManGear.com is printed and delivered by Amazon. You can go to BigManGear.com, see what kind of stuff the Big Man offers, and pick some out, and they will ship it to you.